Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here this morning. Thank you for having me, and thank you, of course, to the organizers and the sponsors for making this all happen. And thank you to everyone who made it down here this early in the morning, especially after a drinks reception. I'll try and talk a little bit quietly in case some people might have headaches for some reason. So like was just said, I'm Katherine Daniels. You can find me on the internet at BeerOps. I'm a senior web operations engineer at Etsy, based out of our headquarters in New York. And I'm the co-author of O'Reilly's Effective DevOps, which is one of the books that you can get for free if you're into books. It is in early release right now, but it is supposed to be actually published at the end of this month, if all goes well, fingers crossed. My co-author is an amazing woman named Jennifer Davis, who works at Chef, one of the awesome sponsors. Go say hi to them at some point. She is a software developer there. I'm an operations engineer, so between the two of us, we're doing some ops dev, I think, writing this book. Anyway, I'm going to be talking today about what we describe in the book as our 4 pillars of effective DevOps. I'm going to talk about those principles and what they are. I'm going to talk about another thing that we describe in the book that is called the DevOps Compact, so an agreement within your organization on how to kind of take these principles and make them work. And then I'm going to go into some hopefully practical, actionable examples for how you can, again, take these principles and apply them within your own organizations, both within engineering and hopefully throughout the whole business. And last night, after a couple glasses of wine, I promised somebody that I would put more cat pictures in my talk. So just to start out, this cat is clearly ready to learn about DevOps. So the 4 pillars of effective DevOps are kind of principles that Jennifer and I came up with that we think describe kind of foundational elements of creating an effective DevOps culture within an organization. So the first pillar that we have is collaboration. And we talk about this in an individual collaboration sense. So individual people within a team working together with shared interactions and input, building towards a common goal, like the common team goals that their team or their manager has defined. And we have this be our first pillar, our first principle, because we kind of feel this is foundational. If you can't get individual people on the same team to be able to work together well, you have very little chance of getting people on different teams to be able to work together. So I think kind of start with principles, start with the more closely aligned goals within a team. But of course, then we have to expand this beyond just individual teams, and so we describe what we call affinity. This is moving, again, from individuals to teams and building up inter-team relationships, creating empathy and trust between different teams, different parts of the organization, and supporting not just the team goals, but the organizational and business goals as well. And this is, I think, what people kind of traditionally think of when they think of DevOps as the dev team and the ops team working together in support of these shared goals. Obviously, we wouldn't be talking about DevOps or anything technology related without talking about tools or technology, but we don't talk about any specific tools. We're not going to say you have to start running Chef or you have to go to the cloud in order to be doing DevOps. When we talk about tools, we talk about them in the more general sense as accelerators of culture that can enhance and support the culture, hopefully, of collaboration and affinity. But when we say that tools are accelerators of culture, we mean that this can go in any direction. Tools will kind of take whatever direction your culture is heading in and enhance that. Whether it's a good direction or a bad direction is kind of up to you. Like Jez said yesterday, it's less about tools and more about the people, the process, and the culture, so how you use the tools within your organization. And our 4th pillar that we describe is scaling. And this is not simply enterprise DevOps or DevOps at scale or something like that. We don't really think that there is a separate enterprise DevOps that is completely distant from regular DevOps, as if that were a thing. But when we talk about scaling, what we're really talking about is inflection points. So applying the first three pillars, collaboration, affinity, and tooling, throughout these various inflection points of an organization's life cycle. So these inflection points might be a startup of 10 people growing to its first 100 people, or going from 500 to 1,000 employees. That can be an inflection point as companies grow. Mergers and acquisitions, or companies splitting in two, like HP split however long ago into HP and HP Enterprise. Going public. Etsy just had an IPO last year, and that was a definite inflection point for our company. And throughout these inflection points, it's important to keep in mind the other principles and how they are going to adapt as your company changes. So here I want to reiterate again that tools reinforce culture, but they do not replace it. You cannot just buy DevOps in a box or DevOps as a service and drop in some tool and expect that that's going to solve any number of organizational problems. Tools will not fix a broken culture. So if you have people that aren't working well together, if you don't have a healthy environment within your organization, Docker's not going to fix that for you. Installing Chef, moving to the cloud, moving from HipChat to Slack or whatever the latest and greatest is, these will not fix underlying cultural issues. If you have people who are refusing to talk to each other, Slack in and of itself isn't going to fix that. It's got a lot of great features, but it's not going to make people talk to each other if they're not already. So again, like Jez said, the point isn't the tools, it is the collaboration and the shared understanding of how we use those tools and what we're trying to accomplish with them. So the next thing that I want to talk about is this idea of the DevOps Compact, which is about process, culture, and shared understanding. And it's about taking these ideas and these principles, the pillars that we have defined and how they're going to be used within your organization, and it makes it explicit rather than implicit, to make sure that we're all on the same page and we can, discuss things more effectively, because DevOps is kind of a folk model where different people have different ideas in their head of what they think DevOps means and what they're imagining when you talk about DevOps. So we've found that it's helpful to kind of more explicitly define this in order to have more meaningful conversations about it. So to describe the DevOps Compact, I'm going to use a rock climbing metaphor, which is something that I really enjoy. There's a lot of different types of climbing, and one of them is called roped climbing. It involves usually two people connected by a rope. One of these people is the climber, and one of them is the belayer. So the climber does the climbing, climbs up the rock, and the belayer makes sure that they are taking in the slack in the rope, because if there is too much slack, the climber has a lot farther to fall, which is obviously not great. If there's not enough slack, the climber doesn't have enough room to maneuver. So there are shared goals when you are doing roped climbing like this. The first and foremost goal is safety. There's a high altitude mountaineer named Ed Viesturs who said getting to the top is optional, but getting down is mandatory. It's important to realize that when you are doing something like this, you have to really prioritize what your goals are. So you do have a goal to climb whatever problem you're trying to climb, but you also want to make sure that you both make it down alive and in one piece. There is a lot of ongoing communication in rock climbing. So at the very beginning, the climber will ask the belayer, "Is belay on? Am I on belay?" And the belayer will check the ropes and the knots and the harnesses and all the equipment, and when they are satisfied that everything looks safe and ready to go, they will say, "Yes, belay is on." And then when the climber is ready to actually start climbing, they will say, "Climbing." And when the belayer is ready to actually start belaying and taking in the slack in the rope, they will say, "Climb on." And this is a pretty well-defined communication sequence within climbing. But there's ongoing communication throughout the climb as well that is also pretty clearly defined. So if the climber wants the belayer to take in any extra slack in the rope, they will say take. Maybe they need a little bit of a rest, maybe they're coming up to a difficult part of the problem and expect that they might fall and they want to have as little slack in the rope as possible. But they have to be able to communicate dynamically and adjust throughout the process of the climb because things can change as you go. The climber might get tired or might get injured and decide that they want to try a different route or to come down early. They have to be able to communicate this to the belayer. The belayer might notice a problem with some of the equipment. They might see bad weather coming in and want to communicate this to the climber, that maybe they should come down early. And the DevOps Compact has these same principles. So there needs to be shared, clearly defined goals. You have to define what it is that you are trying to accomplish with DevOps in your organization. Don't just do DevOps because it's trendy and everyone else is and you want to be able to check it off your list of cool things that we're doing so maybe people will come work for us. There has to be reasons behind why you're doing what you're doing, and it helps a lot if everyone is on the same page. You have a much better hope of getting things done if people know what you're trying to get done. There has to be ongoing communication within the organization. The left hand needs to know what the right hand is doing. One of the problems that DevOps was originally trying to solve was a lack of ongoing communication between dev and ops teams, with throwing stuff over the wall and saying, it's ops problem now. And you have to have the dynamic adjustments and repairs of understanding. So things are going to change throughout the course of your business. You know, you might find unexpected bugs, you might have unexpected outages, you might be changing product direction in response to customer feedback or something that a competitor does, and you have to be able to dynamically adjust this. I mean, the reason that stuff like Agile is so popular is because it enables people to more dynamically and more quickly react and adjust, as opposed to something like waterfall. So we are not the first people to come up with 4 letters to describe DevOps. Damon Edwards and John Willis at DevOps Days Silicon Valley a few years ago, I believe, came up with CAMS. So culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. We realized that we had come up with CATS, the collaboration, affinity, tooling, and scale. And the fact that CATS is a thing doesn't negate the value of CAMS. I think they're both very valuable lenses with which we can think about DevOps. So again, they're not necessarily very precise definitions, but more general principles to guide us and make sure that we're talking about the same things. And because I promised more cat pictures, if you combine CAMS and cats, you get a rock climbing cat. That is a real thing. This cat climbs rocks with her human and posts pictures on the internet. It's pretty adorable. Now, DevOps has been around for 6-7 years now, and I'm sure people are all well aware of the benefits that it can bring to your organization. Jez spoke about this yesterday, talking about Puppet's State of DevOps report, but just to throw out some numbers. These high-performing IT organizations, or DevOps organizations, deploy 30 times more frequently, have 200 times shorter lead times, 60 times fewer failures, and when they do have failures, they are able to recover 168 times faster. On average, these are the numbers from 2015. So server density has this cost of downtime calculator online, where you can go and you can put in your annual revenue, and it will calculate for you how much each minute or hour of downtime is going to cost you. And if you look at these numbers and then imagine being able to recover from a downtime event 168 times faster, that's real money. But I've said this before, I'll say it again, it doesn't matter how shiny your site is if it's down, but it also doesn't matter how good your uptime is if your site isn't solving your customers' problems. So we have to make sure that we're not only solving problems the right way and solving them effectively and efficiently, but we also have to make sure that we are solving the right problems for our customers. So now I'm going to give some hopefully practical examples of ways that you can create more collaboration and affinity within your own organizations. I'm going to start out talking with a lot of examples of some things that we have done in the engineering organization at Etsy, but I don't mean this to be a prescriptive step-by-step guide. Don't cargo cult your DevOps. Don't immediately start doing everything that Etsy is doing just because we're Etsy and we're super cool, though we are super cool. But I want to explain kind of the why, the principles behind these ideas and why they've worked for us. So the first thing that we do when people join Etsy Engineering is they do something called bootcamping, which is nothing to do with military boot camping and fatigues and push-ups or any of that. Boot camping for us is when people new to the organization spend a few weeks working as members of teams other than their own. So boot camps usually last from 1 to 6 weeks. People will most frequently boot camp on 1 to 3 different teams, depending on their interests and how much time they have, because teams do have goals and deadlines, and sometimes you can't spend as much time doing this as you might like. And one of the keys here is that people will make meaningful contributions. They are not going to spend 6 weeks reading documentation and doing busy work. They're going to be working as actual members of this team. So they're learning what the team works on, what their concerns are, and they're getting to know the people on the team and understanding how to work with them. So for example, somebody starting on the ops team might decide to boot camp on the security team. Ops and security work pretty closely together, and building those relationships enables them to then have jump-started these working relationships that they're going to need down the line. So you get to know and you get to work with more people. It's building a lot of empathy and interconnectedness throughout the organization. And you're learning and contributing to these other teams, which again really jumpstarts a good, positive relationship. And if you've had an organization where teams haven't gotten along so well, having new people come in and start out with a brand new positive relationship can do a lot to repair relationships in between teams as a whole. It's also important to note that because this is done at the beginning of somebody's tenure within your organization, it's a lot less disruptive to their own team. Because once you've gotten started on a team, you're in the middle of stuff, people are counting on you to deliver things, and it is a lot harder to pick up and do something else for a month. So when you do this at the beginning, it's a lot less disruptive because your team has survived however many months or years without you. They can deal for a few more weeks. But that doesn't mean that the benefits of this sort of program should be limited to only happening once. So we do what are called senior rotations. Again, spending some time, usually about a month, and we usually have people do this about once a year, usually on their Etsyversary, as we call it. And people will go work on other teams. Because they have been with the company for a while, they're able to make even more meaningful contributions to these teams than they were at the beginning. You have, again, building understanding and empathy and trust between teams. But we found that this also increases engagement and retention throughout the organization as a whole. Because people sometimes want to explore different paths for their career. They might want to switch from doing something more front-end to something more back-end. And being able to do a senior rotation allows people to kind of explore that and do it within your company still. So if they do end up switching teams, yes, you've lost them on their original team, but you've kept them within your organization instead of going to somebody else, which if they're a really good employee, is a good thing no matter what team they're on. And you get greater engagement because sometimes, people get stressed out and they get burnt out. And doing a senior rotation is a really good way to allow people to kind of recharge, take a break, kind of disconnect for a little bit. I am actually, at the moment, doing a senior rotation on the performance team. So I haven't been doing ops for nearly a month. I have been on call. Unfortunately, that happened. Can't get away from that sometimes. But I was able to get a break from the projects that I was working on, and I'm actually now, as I'm nearing the end of my rotation, more excited to go back and work on them than I was a few weeks ago. We have an ongoing program that we call Designated Ops, where people on the ops team are designated points of contact for other teams within the engineering organization. So people who are doing designated ops for other teams will attend other team meetings or other project meetings. You can do this on either a team or a project-based basis. They will identify operational concerns earlier rather than later. So for example, if our API team is putting together some new API endpoints that are going to be used by the website and by various mobile apps, we want to know that they're doing that so we can make sure that we have enough capacity in our API cluster to be able to handle that. Doing proactive monitoring is a really big thing. Like Jez said yesterday, proactive monitoring is a big indicator of these successful, high-performing IT organizations. So I have a story that I like to tell from several jobs, several lifetimes ago. Back when I was a little baby ops, I was sitting at my desk doing my computering, and the CEO of my company comes up to me and he says, "Katherine, this new product is down on mobile. Why the hell aren't you fixing it yet?" And my response, unfortunately, was, sorry, what product? Because there was a new product that had been developed, it had been launched, it went in front of customers, and it went down, and nobody had told the ops team that this existed. There was not a lot of DevOpsing going on within that organization. And obviously, it's not a great thing to have your customers be the ones essentially monitoring your product and telling you if it's up or down. So being able to do that proactively is a big benefit. And so through designated ops, we can make sure that we're doing that we're working with these other teams to find out what they're working on, if it needs to be monitored, how it should be monitored, stuff like that. And we're sharing increased operational understanding throughout the organization, so other teams are learning. Why is it important to monitor things? Why do we care if something is in Chef versus having done it by hand? And then other teams start thinking about these things on their own without us having to, nag them all the time, which is great for everyone. We have designated ops engineers for pretty much every team or project within the organization. It's important to note, though, that how many designated ops assignments any individual person on the ops team will have varies based on the workload, because some teams are a lot more operationally intensive than others. Some teams are more self-service and only come to us if they have, particularly tricky questions. Other teams really don't want to build their own servers and would much rather file a ticket. And we try and support, a wide range of what other teams want from us. We want to be enablers, not blockers. It's also important to note that this is designated ops, but not dedicated. I am not dedicated to only work on the teams that I'm working with. We all have other responsibilities, but what these other teams do have now is a designated point of contact. So if they have a question or a concern, they have somebody that they have a relationship with that they can go talk to, even if the work that they need done ends up getting done by somebody else on my team. So you have a lot of benefits here. You have knowledge being shared both ways. So other teams are learning more about ops, but through these ongoing relationships, we are learning a lot more about these other teams, what their concerns are, and how we can best work with them and best help them get their jobs done. Again, increased visibility, communication, collaboration, and empathy. You might notice that these are kind of common themes. You need this collaboration and empathy. You need people to be talking and really working together throughout the organization. And we don't just do this with ops. We do this with security as well, because security is not something that should be left to the last minute as an afterthought. Security should also be considered throughout the entire process, so we have designated security engineers, or designated security hackers, we call them, You can do this with UX or design, because several teams within our engineering organization create products that other people use, whether those are external, customer-facing, or internal. And having people who understand UX and design and front-end stuff really makes products a lot more usable. As it turns out, a lot of ops people are really good at writing kind of obscure command line tools, not so good at writing usable web interfaces, so it's really nice to have help with that. And I think that any team that has these skills that can be used to broadly support and help other teams within the organization can benefit from a designated program like this. And finally, it's important to have a culture of transparency. So we have open planning meetings. We have architecture reviews when people are planning on making significant changes to our architecture. We have operability reviews that have to happen before things go into production, and these are all open meetings. So we have an architecture review interest group. There's a mailing list that when people are planning an AR, they'll send out the calendar invite and the agenda to this mailing list, and anyone who's interested can come. Whether they want to listen or contribute to the meeting, they can show up. So everyone is pretty well aware of what's going on throughout the engineering organization. And we have open postmortems as well. So Etsy is really into this culture of blameless postmortems, where when something goes wrong, we're not looking for somebody to blame and shame. Nobody's going to get reprimanded or fired for making a mistake. But we do have postmortems as ways of learning from what happened. So we want to figure out the circumstances around an incident, what led to it, and how can we learn from that and hopefully prevent something similar from happening in the future. And having these postmortems be open has a lot of benefits, because other teams might, be able to learn from our mistakes, to realize like, oh, they weren't monitoring that thing and something bad happened. We aren't monitoring that thing. We should go monitor that thing real fast. Or they might have experienced something similar before and can offer advice as to what remediation items they took away from it. So again, you have people and teams throughout the organization learning from each other. Now, a lot of this has been engineering specific, but I think that we can go further than that. So there are more ways that we have of taking the ideas of collaboration and affinity and applying them within the organization as a whole. So non-engineering rotations are something that we do that takes kind of the principle of a bootcamp or a senior rotation, but applies it at a much smaller scale. So the example that I'll use for this are what we call support rotations. These last usually a few hours to a day, and people will help our customer support team out with various items that are in the customer support queue. So there's a couple benefits to this. Obviously, there is a pretty wide range of requests that customers might have or questions that they need answered. And some of these are the customer support equivalent of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Questions that can be answered pretty quickly with a drop into a knowledge base article, something like that. And having engineers come on these rotations and help out with those sort of basic level tasks frees up the customer support team to work on the more complex issues that require their dedicated knowledge and expertise. But it also gives our engineers a really, really good look into how people are actually using the products that they build. Because we are not our own target audience. We encourage everyone in engineering at Etsy to open up an Etsy shop, to go through that process and see what it's like. But by and large, most of us on engineering are not full-time Etsy sellers. So doing something like a customer support rotation really enables us to see what it is like for our customers, and also what it is like to work in these other non-engineering parts of the business. And people are frequently surprised how much it can take out of you to deal with the emotions that can come up in customer support, because unfortunately, people don't really write in that often when they're really happy with something. Sometimes they do, which is always really nice to get, but most often people write in when they're upset. And it is really draining to deal with that, and it gives engineering a lot of empathy for our customer support team to do these kinds of rotations. We try and have shared tools and processes throughout the organization as much as possible, engineering and non-engineering. So a big thing that we have is shared chat system. We're not the cool kids who are using Slack, we're still on IRC, but we have an IRC client that we developed internally that is designed to be very, very user-friendly for people who don't use IRC regularly. So it's got a nice GUI. It interacts with our homegrown staff directory, so you can hover over somebody's nickname and you see not only their full name, but it also pulls up their picture in the staff directory, stuff like that. And this is important because I've worked at places, and I'm sure we all have, where there's multiple different chat systems going on at once. Different teams have their own. Some people will be using more than one, and you have to figure out, okay, I need to talk to that person. Which chat client do I use? And they're not online on the one that I know they prefer, but they are online on this other one, and it's a big mess. So by having people have a shared chat system, you make it easier for people to communicate. Shared ticketing systems, so people can not only see what other teams, other departments are working on, but if you need to share work between them, move tickets between them, you can actually do that. I worked at a place once where the dev team, the DevOps team, and the ops team each, just go with it, each had their own ticketing system. So nobody knew what was going on, and obviously not super effective at getting things done as an organization and as a business. And having shared processes for things like reviews or postmortems. We don't limit postmortems to just, site outages. We've got, teams who are responsible for communicating with customers, and if they notice that like an email campaign that they sent out didn't go over very well, for example, they could have a postmortem for that, and they can use the same tooling. We have a tool that we wrote in open source called Morgue that does things like pull in chat logs from IRC during an incident. It links to Jira so we can easily see the tickets for remediation items. And having people have the same tool means that there's kind of this shared understanding of the tools and the processes throughout the entire company. I think it was Job yesterday who said, when he was talking about developing in the open, give everyone the same tool. And I think that's a really good principle to follow. Pairing is a thing that we have people do in engineering, obviously, but we don't think that that should be limited to just people on the same team. So if you have projects or work that involve people on multiple teams or multiple departments, you can have people pair from those multiple teams to sit down and work with each other. Again, more communication and collaboration. And I really like this because it kind of shifts the emphasis from which team you're on to what product or what project you're working on, what feature are you trying to implement for customers. And what this does is it develops this focus on the customers, which ultimately is where it should be. Get to know your customers, especially if, like us, you aren't your own target audience, your own target market. Get to know your customers so you can really focus on helping them out, because that's what we're trying to do as a business. So Jeff Sussna wrote this blog post about empathy being the essence of DevOps back in 2014. And he said, empathy allows software makers and operators to help each other deliver the best possible functionality and operability on behalf of their customers. Which is great. I love this quote. But I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by limiting it to just developers and operators. So we could turn that around and kind of say empathy allows organizations to help each other deliver the best possible solutions on behalf of their customers. It's more than just dev and more than just ops. And it's going back and making sure that you are solving the right problems, that you're solving the problems that your customers actually have. We're trying to break down silos here in between dev and ops, but I think it's important that we not then create another silo between technical and non-technical. I've seen a trend of putting engineers up on a pedestal and saying the engineers are the most important part of the company and nothing else really matters. And that's just not true. And I want us to avoid making any other group feel like they are less than others. Because a successful organization needs to be really inclusive of all the skill sets that are a part of it and all the skills that help make a business successful. So this is finding as many ways as possible to support and connect each other, to build bridges, not physically, not literally, obviously. Like people said yesterday, we are not building physical bridges, but we are building metaphorical bridges to make our organizations as inclusive as possible. Now, I think, again, we can take this one step further. We started talking about individual collaboration, moved from individuals to teams, from teams to your organization as a whole, but I think we can go further and move and talk about creating not just inclusive organizations, but an inclusive industry. So if you'll bear with me, this is a little bit of a rant. Now, I know Jez asked you to do this yesterday, but the point still stands. I want you to look around the room and see how many people there are that look like you. And again, this isn't people that look like you in terms of, oh, if I saw that person walking down the street, I'd do a double take because they're clearly my doppelganger and I thought I was looking in a mirror. But how many people are in your same demographic? And I'm saying this again, well, one, because I put my slides together before I saw Jez talk yesterday, but I don't see him. I think he might be on a plane, so he doesn't know that I'm saying similar things. But as long as there are rooms like this that are so homogenous, conversations like this need to keep happening. And these conversations aren't always the most comfortable, but they are important. So, again, for most of you, the answer is going to be a lot of people in this room look like me, because there are a lot of white men in this room, which, again, nothing wrong with that. I also have good friends who are white men. But we need to be asking ourselves, why are there so few people who are different? And some people will try and say that it's a pipeline problem. They will say that, well, girls just aren't as interested in science and math and programming, and so they don't study it in university, they're not getting CS degrees, so we can't hire them. Like, we would if we could, but they're just not there, so it's not our problem. But that's a lazy answer. Not only is it not true, but it is trying to absolve organizations of responsibility for what's going on within them. It's the diversity equivalent of throwing it over the wall and saying it works fine in dev, it's ops problem now. Don't push all of the responsibility onto the pipeline, onto the universities, onto schools. Because while it is true that there are, fewer women getting CS degrees than there are men in many parts of the world, that's not the only thing that's going on here. It ignores the people who do get into the industry and leave. And again, it's not because they're all having babies. People leave because being a woman in this industry is frankly exhausting a lot of the time. Being the only one of anything is exhausting. So people talk about diversity and inclusivity. And I've heard this sort of metaphor describing it a few different ways. But I really liked this one. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusivity is feeling comfortable and safe enough to dance at the party. It's not enough to just get people in the door. You can't just hire some women or some people of color in your organization and call it good. You need to look at things like the rate of promotion, the compensation differences within your organizations. Jez mentioned that high-performing teams were inclusive, and that means psychological safety. People need to feel safe and included in groups, in the industry, in order to do their best work. They shouldn't be made to feel like an outsider. And frankly, shit like this doesn't make me feel very comfortable. Stuff like this makes me feel like an outsider. Or things like this. Microsoft, at a game event recently this year, decided that it was a good idea to hire women in little tiny Catholic schoolgirl uniforms to socialize and dance with men at this event. And of course, companies keep saying, well, this isn't us. This doesn't represent our values. Okay. I know that we've all worked with computers before, and who here has said, okay, well, this should work in theory? It always works in theory, but theory and practice are often very, very different. And you can say in theory that you value diversity and you value inclusivity. But if you keep doing things like this, the values that you display in practice, those are the ones that actually matter. I'm not trying to publicly shame people just for the sake of being mean. What I want to do is encourage people to be mindful of how you come across and how your words and your actions can come across to people who aren't like you. So intent is not magical. It doesn't matter if you didn't mean to exclude anybody, but you might have ended up doing that anyway. So remember postmortems. You can have postmortems for events like these, for cultural things. It's about transparency and it's about learning. We don't want to just fire people because people make mistakes. People will do the wrong thing and people will say the wrong thing. But we want to learn from this so we can be better as an industry. So, another obligatory cat picture. I want you to ask yourself, do you feel comfortable enough to relax, to share your ideas in your groups, in your teams? Or do you kind of feel like you have to be twice as good as everyone else around you? Do you feel like you are kind of responsible for representing your entire gender or your entire race because you're the only one in the room who looks like you? Ask yourself this. Ask yourself, who do you see being represented in the tech industry? Do you see yourself, people who look like you, being successful in this industry? Who is on stage at conferences? Who are on panels? Who are the people writing the big books and the blog posts, getting featured in tech articles? Who is getting the venture capital money? Do you have role models that look like you that could be you in 5 to 10 years? Or do you see people like yourself being reduced to stereotypes? How would it feel if people talked about you like this? So Man Who Has It All on Twitter is a parody account that takes things that are so commonly said about women and about mothers, and it turns them around and says them about men and about fathers to kind of highlight just how ridiculous these things are. If it sounds ridiculous to say something like this about dads, then maybe don't say it about moms. My mom has worked in this industry for over 30 years. She's pretty badass. She doesn't need some dumbed down version of your product, and I don't think she appreciates this kind of condescension any more than I do. Or do you see people like you being objectified? Are people like you the ones on stage presenting at conferences, or are people like you the ones who are booth babes and Catholic schoolgirls, who are just there for decoration rather than being celebrated for their knowledge and expertise? How would it feel to have people take you less seriously just because of how you look? I mean, really, can handsome men be taken seriously in business? What do you do with all that facial hair during meetings? It's ridiculous. Or do you find that people like you just aren't being seen at all? Now, if you haven't experienced this, and I imagine most of you haven't, and that's fine, but I want you to take a minute and imagine what it would be like to have to deal with this day in and day out. What would it feel like to feel like you have to be twice as good as everyone around you, and then even then you still get left out of these conversations? How would it feel if there were panels of people talking about you and talking over you like this? So PayPal recently had a panel about gender equality that consisted entirely of men. And of course, they then turned around and said, oh, well, the focus of this was male allies. And that's fine, male allies are awesome and important, but maybe if you're talking about gender equality, you should talk to some women. Don't just include one gender and call that equality, just like you shouldn't have a panel on racial equality that consists only of white people. And there are, of course, people who will say that this is just chance, that because there are so many men in the industry that it'll randomly happen that you get panels or conference lineups that are all men. But no, somebody did the math, and it's not just chance. Diverse panels and diverse speaker lineups are better for your audiences because they help keep conferences and help keep the industry from becoming an echo chamber. I think it's really easy to say that inclusivity isn't a problem when you are already being included. Because you don't feel excluded. And so you can't necessarily imagine what it would be like to feel like this all day, every day. So my good friend Bridget Cromhout tweeted this a couple years ago. When I hear ops guys, I don't feel included. I feel erased. I want to wave and say, hello, I'm sitting right here. I'm not a guy and I do ops. So there are people who will say that guys is gender neutral. And they'll say the ops guys or the Java guys. I'm not a guy. I don't identify as a guy. It's easy for somebody who is a man who does say, yes, I'm an ops guy, to say that, of course, ops guys is inclusive. But it's not. And while we're on the topic, please don't do the thing where you say, hey guys, and then turn to the one woman in the room and say, and girl. One, that is just highlighting the fact that she is different. She's already well aware. Pointing that out, not making her feel more included. And can we please stop calling grown-ass women girls? Now, I know that this is not done out of malice. Nobody means to exclude people. But words matter. But there's good news. And it's not just that I found more cat pictures on the internet. Don't worry, the internet has not run out. But you can help. We can all help. We're engineers, and I want to see us, again, using our skills towards solving people problems in addition to just engineering ones. So some things that you can do. Don't speak on panels that are all male or all white. If you get invited to speak at a conference and the entire conference lineup published so far is white men, you can go to the conference organizers and say, no, I'm not going to do that. Don't speak at events that don't have a code of conduct. Again, talk to the conference organizers and tell them that a code of conduct is important to you too. This is using your privilege, using the voice that you have. Like Jez said yesterday, people are much more willing to take a chance on a white man and to listen to a white man, and you can use that power for good or for awesome. You can support diverse and inclusive organizations. And you can get to know people who don't look like you. So that if a conference organizer comes to you and says, hey, do you want to talk on my all-white dude conference? And you can say, actually, I know some pretty kick-ass women and people of color. Why don't you ask them? So to that end, there's things like the Techies Project. This is a photo and interview collection that is designed to showcase more people in the tech industry. It's just in San Francisco right now, but it's giving people who don't always get this chance the chance to have a spotlight, to tell their stories, to share their challenges and their successes. Jez mentioned Shanley yesterday when he was talking about culture, and Shanley runs Model View Culture, which is an independent media platform that covers technology, culture, and diversity. It aims to highlight the achievements and the work of diverse communities in tech, and as far as I know, it has never referred to Google's cloud as the G-spot. Read this. Buy a subscription for your office. Encourage other people to read it as well. There's Fund Club. This helps for just $100 a month, which I'm sure we all have, helps support products and organizations that are focused on diversity and inclusivity in tech. Give your money to people like these who need it. Every little bit helps. Project Include, which was just announced yesterday, I believe, helps companies actually build meaningful inclusion. So when they do something like invite a bunch of strippers on stage at a conference and say, we're working on it, Project Include is designed to help them actually make meaningful progress on working on it, so that their values in practice match their values in theory. And you can help give money to organizations like these that help support these various groups of people who have for so long been underrepresented in the tech industry. You can learn about unconscious bias. So I know that nobody sets out to be racist or sexist. You know, this isn't Mad Men anymore. Hopefully nobody is going around slapping women on the ass and telling them to get back in the kitchen. But unconscious biases still exist. And if you don't start learning about these things, you can't start trying to combat them. Learn about privilege. Privilege has been described as kind of going through life on easy mode, like playing a video game on easy mode. This does not mean that you've never struggled, that you've never had challenges, that you've never had people be biased against you, but it does mean that there are a lot fewer systemic challenges that you are going to have to face. Learn about what intersectionality means, the intersection of the different axes of privilege. So I've talked a lot about gender in these examples because it's pretty easy to understand, and I am qualified to talk about my experiences as a woman in tech. But that doesn't mean that you can just hire a bunch of white women, get some white women on stage and be like, okay, we've got diversity, we're done. You need to be aware that there are issues of racism and transphobia and homophobia, and these different axes of privilege impact people in a lot of different ways. And finally, I want you to speak up. Like the people in the New York City subway say, if you see something, say something. The standard that you walk by is the standard that you accept. So if you see events that are all male, all white, that don't have a code of conduct, if you see people being harassed, if you see some guy in your meetings interrupting women, talking over them, stealing their ideas, taking credit for their work, you can use the power and the privilege that you have and say something. This doesn't necessarily mean being a white knight and talking over women or talking over people of color, speaking for them. But you can do your part and take part in these conversations. Don't put all of the onus on women, on people of color, on these people who have less privilege to do all of the work of fixing these problems. Rant over. Here is a cat picture for making it through that. Thank you for staying with me this early in the morning. I believe that this is important because successful teams are diverse teams. Studies have shown this over and over and over. Winning in the market in business requires a broad range of perspectives, and that requires hiring and retaining a wide range of quality talent. There is no talent shortage. The talent pool is so much bigger because there are so many women and people of color who just aren't being given a chance right now. It comes back to being about empathy. Empathy allows people to help each other create the best, most inclusive, most successful industry on behalf of everyone working in it. So if empathy can allow devs and ops to care about each other and our respective challenges and struggles in the workplace, then empathy can make teams and organizations, the industry and the world, more compassionate and more inclusive places. So when we're thinking about the 4 pillars of effective DevOps, we are thinking about empathy and inclusivity. So if DevOps is important to your business, as I imagine it is, then that means that empathy and inclusivity need to be important to you as well. So what I would ask you to do your part, break down silos, build those metaphorical bridges, and to always be empathetic and inclusive. Thank you.